The hero expected a camp in the fresh air, but instead found himself in a lonely place, reminiscent of a harsh survival situation. There was not a soul around, not even a village, and he wondered if he could cope here. He raised his open palm in front of him. Everything had to work, because he had special crafting equipment. A knife appeared.
I would be very happy if you subscribed to the channel, liked and wrote a comment rating this manga on a scale from 1 to 10. Your opinion is very important to me. This will help me better understand what my audience is interested in, because you are really important to me.
In his hand. The first task was to find food. Thus began the story of survival in the wild forest of another world with only this weapon. His name was Himuro Sujiro. He was an ordinary worker who had recently moved to Tokyo. Due to various circumstances, he had changed jobs several times. At 35, he felt like an old man. He toiled without rest, and at his new job he was even given leave for overwork. As always, Himuro returned late in the evening. That day, tired and inattentive, he didn't notice a truck driving straight at him. The car hit him. Consciousness was already fading when he suddenly heard a woman's voice. The stranger told him not to be afraid, explaining that his life had been cut short by an accident. Himuro was surprised. Why was he hearing a voice if he was dead? The woman replied that it was more complicated than that, and reminded him of the time he had once picked up a goddess statue and returned it to the altar. She was the goddess who had decided to reward him after his death. Himuro asked doubtfully if she really was a goddess. The voice confirmed it, but asked him not to dwell on it. She said he was a kind man and regretted that his life had been so difficult. So the goddess decided to extend his journey and send his soul to another world. The man considered this. It was as if he had a chance to create a new preservation. The goddess clarified that there were many worlds and asked what he desired. He replied, a measured life. Himuro dreamed of sleeping in his own room as much as he wanted, not having to travel on a crowded train in the morning, not having to work in an office where the slightest mistake was punishable by mountains of overtime, and not having to eat tasteless store-bought food. He recalled visiting the village and going on hikes in his youth. The food he'd prepared with his own hands seemed the most delicious he'd ever eaten. He recalled the wind in the leaves and the crackling fire, soothing his weary soul. Himuro confessed to the goddess that this kind of food, made with his own hands, was the most delicious to him. She joyfully remarked that it was no accident that he had once picked up her statuette, calling it fate. The goddess said that as a good man, she would grant him a special tool, a craftsman's tool. She raised 2 fingers and explained that it had 2 properties. Himuro would be able to create anything, and it would be stored within his chest. When he wanted to use it, he only needed to say its name. He thanked her. The goddess was surprised that he was even grateful for a gift and once again called him a good man. It was time to go, and she promised to find the best place for him. The goddess called herself Anna. She said she had already reborn him in a new world, blessed his soul, and granted his body a sacred weapon that would help him live happily. Anna smiled and transferred the remainder of her powers to Himuro. The man was surprised by her generosity. After that, he opened his eyes in another world. He felt wonderful. The fatigue was gone, the pain was gone, the heaviness in his body was gone. This healthy state made him happy. Himuro thanked the goddess not only for the weapon but also for the healing. He even tried to sit up, rejoicing at the likeness, but stopped, remembering the gift of the tool. He uttered the words craft equipment, and his palm flashed with a bright light. Himuro was slightly taken aback. A black-handled knife appeared in his hand. He recognized the weapon's appearance and noted how comfortable it felt to hold. When he cast the spell again, it vanished. He thought he could summon and remove it freely, like an anime character. He figured that out, but the problem remained. He was in a dense forest with no signs of life around. Not exactly what Himuro wanted. Himuro activated his power again. He certainly enjoyed solo adventures, but now he found himself alone in the middle of a dense forest. He needed more equipment to survive. He wore only simple fantasy clothing, and his only equipment was his sacred knife. He closed his eyes and concentrated. He considered whether there was any point in complaining. The first rule of survival was not to panic, to assess the situation, and to decide what could be done. Himuro glanced at the reflection in the knife blade. The goddess had said this tool could change shape and return to its owner. It was time to test it. He spoke the activation words. Himuro remembered two of the weapon's properties. The first was called Tool. It allowed the knife to change its shape into any tool at will. This ability amazed him. An axe appeared in his hands. Now he was sure it worked. Gripping the handle, he realized he had to test his strength in the deserted forest. He swung the axe and brought it down on the tree. The blade struck the trunk with a cracking sound, and the thick wood split into splinters. But the enormous trunk began to fall straight toward him. Himuro froze in horror. He had just been reborn, and now he was facing death. He collapsed to the ground and opened his mouth, ready to scream. Opening his eyes, he saw that the tree had stopped and was not falling. This stunned him. Then he remembered the second power, improvement of conditions. The goddess explained, if you're building a birdhouse, for example, you usually have to hold nails with your fingers or plain wood. But with this power, everything could be simplified. Even if you lack tools or parts, the object will naturally take the desired shape. You can hold the board in place in midair and reverse the effect if necessary. Himuro thought of the power as a kind of glue, holding everything together as needed. The goddess said that together, the tool and improved conditions would transform his weapon into a portable workshop. Himuro promised to figure it out himself. Emerging from under the tree, he touched it with his hand. An axe stuck into the ground nearby, leaving a crater. Himuro said aloud that he understood, and the axe vanished into thin air. The knife was back in his hand. The man frowned. He had to be extremely careful with that kind of power. Now he needed a walking stick. It would be handy for pushing aside branches, checking the soil, or searching for snakes. Himuro picked up the stick, deciding it would do the job. First, he trimmed it. With a sharp flick of the knife, he trimmed away the excess, creating a perfectly straight edge. He noted that this had been much more difficult for him before. Then he removed the bark. It took less than 5 minutes. The smooth surface, the precise cut, all thanks to the power of the tool. Himuro turned the piece over in his hands. He made a handle and secured it using improved conditions. Thus, a ready-made walking stick was born. Testing the effect, he swung it and hit trees. No damage occurred. The handle and barrel remained intact. He could remove the enhancement if he wished. A knife capable of transforming into anything and the power to lock onto any object, these were astonishing possibilities. Himuro gripped the cane and realized, now he could survive in this forest. Having completed the project, he decided to look for water. A person can only survive 3 days without it. A lack of fluid quickly leads to dehydration and weakness. Walking through the dense forests was scary, but he reminded himself that he had once spent the night in the wilderness. This world had been given to him by a goddess. Moving forward meant moving towards something better. Now he was free from his former gray life. His stomach rumbled. Himuro remembered the last time he'd eaten. He knew it was time to find food. After wandering through the forest for a long time, he stopped abruptly and opened his eyes, noticing something ahead. Himuro finally found a body of water. The river water looked clear, but he decided not to drink yet, simply remembering the place where he could always quench his thirst. Then he thought about where to spend the night. It could get cold at night, and he needed to build a shelter. Camping by the river seemed too cool, so he chose a clearing among the trees. The plan was simple: construct a structure out of 3 poles and some kind of rope, but securing the top proved to be the most difficult part. Using his handicraft equipment, Himuro managed easily, even without rope. He quickly erected the frame and covered it with thick leaves to protect it from rain and wind. He understood that the ground quickly drained heat. So he laid thick branches inside, then leaves and grass on top to make sleeping warmer. The tent was ready. Himuro crouched inside, hugging his knees, and again noted how useful his strength was. Building a shelter usually takes a long time, as he has to find and process suitable branches. But thanks to his ability, he finished in an hour, working non-stop until sunset. Finished, Himuro stretched contentedly and closed his eyes, rejoicing at his strong body. Suddenly, a noise came from the side. Himuro turned around and saw a small animal, a hare with a horn on its forehead, emerged from the forest. The animal was medium-sized and at first seemed harmless. But upon noticing the boy, the hare became wary, and Himuro tensed. Suddenly, the little creature attacked. Himuro managed to raise his walking stick, and the horn struck it. The man said the name of the equipment out loud. At this point he used the power of improving conditions, fixing the hare's horn in the cane so that it could not be freed. Himuro put down his cane and stepped back, crossing his arms. He said he'd grown up in the countryside and knew the value of caution. All wild animals were hostile to new irritants, so they shouldn't be underestimated. A bead of sweat trickled down his face, but his movements remained swift and confident. He folded his palms in prayer and thanked the goddess for her help, calling the prey food. Hearing this, the hare began to scurry and make noise, but Himuro only clutched his cane, thinking of his own survival. The little animal lowered its ears and looked at him with shining eyes. Himuro smiled and said that the plaintive sounds wouldn't stop it. The new world turned out to be much more alive than he expected. Sometime later, he sat by the river, butchering the carcass. He placed the organs in a wooden container and noted that the hare's heart was unusually shaped, but the rest of the body resembled a normal animal. He rinsed the carcass in water to remove blood and insects. There was a rustling sound behind him. Himuro spun around, clutching his cane tightly. He assumed the scent of blood might have attracted other animals. But a dark-furred puppy emerged from the bushes. Its tongue lolled out and it looked at the man. Himuro lowered his cane, surprised by the sight. Smiling broadly, he beckoned the dog over, thinking the puppy had probably strayed from the pack. He wondered out loud if the little one was hungry. Himuro pointed to the container with the hare's entrails, allowing the puppy to eat. The puppy immediately dug in. Himuro asked if it was tasty and noticed the bow around the animal's neck. Then he began to wonder why the puppy was alone. He probably had an owner. The puppy straightened up, licked its lips, and looked straight at him. After a short bark, the dog disappeared into the bushes. Himuro crouched down to pick up the container, thinking that since there was a bow, his owner was somewhere nearby. Looking inside, he was surprised to realize that the dog had only eaten the heart. Suddenly, a girl with blonde hair pulled back into a high ponytail emerged onto the shore. She held a bow in her hands, and a quiver of arrows hung at her side. Her long elven ears made her identity clear. Himuro looked up and realized he was actually an elf. The girl asked him if he'd seen a small puppy with a bow. He guessed it was her pet and, smiling, began telling her about his encounter with the animal. But the elf interrupted him abruptly, gesturing with a trembling hand toward the wooden container. She stuttered as she asked if he had butchered the dog. Himuro hastened to explain that the container contained the entrails of a hare, and the puppy had run off into the bushes. The girl pressed her hand to her chest, smiled with relief, and thanked God. She apologized for the misunderstanding and said she'd hurry to catch up with her pet. Himuro wished her good luck in a friendly manner. The girl smiled broadly and thanked him. Then she leaped lightly into the tree and began to move higher and higher until she disappeared among the branches. Himuro watched and realized that for the first time in his life he had seen a real elf. After a while, he focused on survival again. He needed to find food, water, shelter, clothing, and fire. He found dry branches, grass, and even resin for the fire. He used crafting equipment to make the rest. Himuro managed to start a fire on his very first try. He used the bow method, he twirled a sharp stick with the bowstring, and the friction caused the fire. Having obtained a flame, he turned to water. He fashioned a container from bark that could be used when heated to 100 degrees Celsius. He peeled off a thin layer of bark, softened it with water, and dried it in the sun, thus creating a vessel. It was in such a container that the hare's organs were once stored. He also made a bowstring from finely twisted bark. Holding the steaming container to his face, Himuro carefully tasted the boiled water and realized that it was ordinary and had no foreign taste. Now it was time to prepare the meat. Coals and a stone slab were needed for cooking. A regular stone would have been fine, but Himuro decided to test the knife's capabilities. If it could cut wood so easily, could it handle stone? After testing it, he created a slab and seared some hare meat, then placed it on a wooden plate. For the steak, he chose the back part, considering it the most delicious. He folded his palms in a prayerful gesture and wished himself a bon appetit. He cut the meat, speared a piece with his fork, and popped it into his mouth. With each bite, my mouth filled with a juicy, meaty flavor. Hare meat is usually dry, similar to chicken, but this one was fatty and sweet, reminiscent of duck. Himuro exclaimed with delight and immediately cut off another piece. It was unsalted and unseasoned, but the taste was exquisite. He smiled blissfully. The simple meat, grilled over coals and stone, tasted like haute cuisine. Chewing the steak, he thought he should cook the thigh, too. The fire was generously warm, the coals crackling pleasantly. Himuro enjoyed the food and the rare silence. It was an indescribable feeling of comfort. He sat by the fire, the light of the flames reflecting in his happy eyes. Himuro remembered the rule of 3 hours without heat, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food, and that's it. With his crafting equipment, he had everything: food, water, shelter, utensils, and even a fortified shelter. He decided to make more utensils and expand the dwelling, but he was distracted by a noise. Turning around, Himuro saw a puppy with a bow, who barked cheerfully. Himuro wondered where the elf who had been looking for the puppy was. The puppy itself tilted its head cutely to the side, and Himuro again found the animal incredibly adorable. He couldn't resist such a face. Himuro held out his hand and asked if the puppy was lost. It came closer, sniffed his fingers, and allowed him to scratch its chin. In response to his question about food, the dog barked cheerfully. Himuro rested his chin on his hand and watched the little animal for a while. He decided that the puppy would definitely need to be returned to its owner, but that would be done in the morning. Having settled into the tent, the boy lay down, his hands behind his head, and the puppy curled up right on his stomach. The second day of his stay in the other world began in the morning. Himuro's first task was to find the puppy's owner. Meanwhile, the dog climbed onto his shoulder and tried to lick his ear, causing Himuro to laugh and beg for mercy. To keep his bearings, he marked the trees with crosses. Himuro was certain the puppy couldn't have strayed too far from its owner, meaning she lived nearby. Having encountered an elf, the boy wondered if there were other races in these parts. The elf girl sat on the rocks by the river, wiping the water off her leg. The cleansing seemed to make her feel different, renewed. Suddenly, the puppy became alert, jumped off Himuro's shoulder, and rushed forward, baring his teeth. Himuro didn't immediately understand the reason, but he guessed an enemy was nearby and tightened his grip on his walking stick. Soon, a loud squeal was heard. Himuro assumed it was a battle cry and suspected the elf was in danger. Calling the puppy to follow him, he rushed toward the source of the sound. The scene before him was a huge griffin waving its clawed paws, while the elf held it at bay with a magical beam. The bird recovered from the blow, and the girl remarked with displeasure that the enemy was too strong. The puppy barked, attracting attention, and the griffin and the elf noticed Himuro waving his hand. The beast abruptly changed its target and lunged at the boy. Himuro, glad to have the attention diverted to him, conjured a hammer and hurled it straight at the monster, loudly shouting the name of its ability. The projectile hit its target perfectly. A bead of sweat rolled down Himuro's face, and he quietly activated the condition-enhancing power. The hammer returned to his hand. Himuro shielded his eyes and acknowledged it was a weapon of mass destruction. The girl was amazed that he'd managed to kill it with one blow and asked who he was. She remarked that she hadn't seen him since yesterday and wished him a good morning. Himuro awkwardly returned the greeting, and the puppy joyfully ran to his owner. The boy felt awkward, an elf wearing a short towel stood before him. She smiled, waved her hand, and asked if he was really a human or a god of war. She explained that the monster had attacked her during her morning bath, apologizing for her appearance. Himuro raised his hands, showing open palms, and turned his head away, emphasizing that the main thing was that no one was hurt. He called himself an ordinary man, but the girl pointed out that a mere human couldn't have brought down a griffin with a single blow. The bird lay unconscious by the tree. Himuro handed her his sweater, and she accepted it gratefully. The elf threw her hand behind her head and admitted that he had indeed saved her, as she had nothing left but 2 daggers. She promised to repay him double, but Himuro replied that was not necessary, picking up the puppy and adding that he had come to return the pet to its owner. The girl explained that the puppy's parents had abandoned him and he was barely surviving, so she took him in. She stroked the puppy's head and smiled warmly. Himuro called the little one a truly lucky one. The elf remembered she hadn't introduced herself. She gave her name, Misty, and explained that she was a high elf living in this forest. In return, she asked the boy's name. Holding a quickly climbing puppy on his shoulder, Himuro introduced himself as Sujiro Himuro and explained that he had arrived there only yesterday and was an ordinary man. Misty changed into her clothes and apologized for the delay, glad they had time to dry. Himuro remarked that she looked beautiful. The elf's cheeks flushed slightly, and she called him a flatterer and hinted at his womanizing, only to be told it was merely a statement of fact. Smiling, she thanked him for the compliment. Misty brought up the problem. After the fight with the griffin, her belongings were destroyed, with only her clothes and a few small items surviving, and her bow was broken. Himuro asked if there was a village nearby so he could accompany her and help her replenish her supplies. The girl crossed her arms and replied that there were no settlements nearby. She added that she had lived alone for about 10 years. Himuro was embarrassed for asking an unnecessary question, but Misty waved her hand, explaining that she had left home of her own free will and chosen a life in the forest. The elf explained that their ancestor had blessed this forest, calling it sacred. However, their descendants ultimately did not remain to live here. She explained that the forest was home to creatures found nowhere else, and unique trees. No race had settled there for 1,000 years. For her, living here was a challenge. Listening with interest, Himuro wondered how the forest could have remained untouched for a millennium. Misty looked at him in bewilderment and asked if he didn't know. The elf pointed to the knife mark on the trunk and said the local trees were as hard as stone. The monsters here were also unusually strong. The forest had been created during the Age of Gods, and after its end, no race could withstand the harsh conditions. Himuro plunged his knife into the tree, easily piercing it to the hilt. Misty's smile turned to determination, and she thrust her dagger in close. However, the blade only penetrated a few centimeters, while Himuro's weapon sank deep into the wood. The girl fell to her knees and pounded the ground with her fists, lamenting that she had lost without a chance. Himuro pulled out his knife and said it was all about his weapon, not his strength. The puppy licked his owner's cheek, and she looked up. Misty leaped to her feet and bowed deeply, calling him God-branded and begging forgiveness for her behavior. Himuro bowed as well, admitting he didn't understand her words. She then explained that he was the wielder of a sacred weapon, and such men were revered as priests. Himuro noted that he had underestimated the value of this gift and asked her to address him as she had before. The elf beamed. Misty folded her fingers in victory and offered to bring him some salt from her stash. She said that without salt, a person couldn't survive, and she would gladly share it. Himuro pointed out that she didn't have to, but she exclaimed that she did. Misty abruptly approached him and shook her fist, reminding him that he'd saved her from the griffin and returned the puppy, and therefore she owed him retribution. With that, she disappeared into the forest, shouting for him to wait. Himuro remained with the puppy, feeling uneasy. Even though all her equipment had been destroyed, she still sought a way to thank him. Himuro repeated these words to himself and remembered the goddess, who also appreciated kindness. This brought a smile to his face. Rolling up his sleeves, Himuro decided that he should repay Misty by cooking her some food. He collected several types of greens reminiscent of familiar plants from the previous world: mustard greens, onions, watercress, and parsley. They needed to be washed and boiled in water. Himuro decided they were perfectly edible. He'd already tested their edibility yesterday, tasting and smelling the herbs. Nothing had happened to his body, meaning they were safe to eat. But Himuro knew his body had been blessed by the goddess, and it wouldn't do for anyone else to repeat the experiment. At that moment, Misty returned to the shore and apologized for the delay. The girl brought a heavy sack and asked if he was cooking something. Himuro explained he was going to cook a rabbit and asked if she had brought salt. Misty handed him a large lump of rock salt and thanked him for saving her. Himuro folded his hands in prayer and gratefully accepted the gift. Misty remarked that it was a trifle and added that she hadn't yet repaid him properly. She warned that repayment might be delayed, as all she had now were magic and daggers. Then Himuro asked if she could buy weapons in the human village. Misty replied that there were no settlements nearby and she had nothing to trade. She sat down, looking thoughtfully at the puppy, and said she wasn't sure she could take care of him when she barely had enough for herself. She apologized for her words, calling them strange. Himuro smiled and said he understood, as he loved dogs himself. Misty called him a good person, to which he responded in kind. Intrigued by his cooking, she approached and asked if he was going to boil rabbit. Himuro explained that he was making broth. To make broth, he dropped the spine and ribs into the water. After it boiled, he skimmed off the foam and continued simmering. When the aroma blossomed, he removed the bones and added the meat, intending to then filter out the excess fat. Misty thoughtfully repeated the new word to herself. The girl, slightly embarrassed, asked Himuro what the word broth meant. He was surprised to realize that such a concept didn't exist in this world. Himuro scratched his neck and looked away, offering Misty a try if she was interested. She perked up and asked if she could eat with him. He replied that he didn't know if she'd like it and had warned her about it beforehand. Misty assured him she'd definitely like it, since it was rabbit meat, and such dishes were usually only available to aristocrats. Then Himuro asked how she would prepare it if she were her own person. The elf explained that she'd skin it, roast it over a fire, and feed the bones and entrails to the dog. If there were any spices, she'd add them. This description reminded Himuro of simple country cuisine. He said the food would be ready soon and invited Misty to play with the puppy. The girl walked off toward the forest, and Himuro apologized silently. He came from a world where food was considered an art form and couldn't settle for two simple dishes. Soon he grilled rabbit fillet with green mustard sauce, served it with onions and watercress, and made a parsley soup. Misty was pleasantly surprised. The girl lifted the bowl and noted with delight that she had never seen soup so clear. She saw her face reflected in the surface. Blowing on the spoon, she carefully tasted it. Her eyes widened with delight. She exclaimed that it was incredibly delicious and admitted she hadn't eaten food like this in 100 years. Himuro smiled contentedly. The salt balance was perfect, and the meat was also delicious. He thought that such meat would quickly become popular in Japan. Chewing a piece of steak, he noted that the meat tasted better today than yesterday. Misty smiled and said he was probably just having a lucky day. Himuro, however, believed her presence enhanced the flavor. He agreed with a smile that the day had indeed been a success. After the meal, Misty asked him to name the puppy. Himuro was surprised, but she explained, receiving a name from a god-branded one is almost like a blessing. The puppy and its owner looked at it expectantly, and Himuro paused. A few moments later, he named the dog Matsuke's. The puppy barked joyfully. Himuro recalled the legend of a horse of the same name that belonged to Maeda Tashimace and chuckled to himself. He didn't tell the girl the true reason for his name choice, only saying that in his world it was the name of a popular horse. Misty approved of the choice. Then Himuro asked about the griffin, whether he could take its meat. She replied that the meat was too smelly. Lost in thought, Misty added that they could collect claws and magic stones. When Himuro asked, she explained that the stones formed near the monster's heart, strengthening it. They were usually prized, but the stone was unlikely to be of any use this time. The girl admitted she'd already found the remains of the stone from his attack and showed him the shiny shards. Himuro realized he should aim for the head in the future, but Misty cautioned, not all monsters could be defeated so quickly. She suggested feeding the stone to Matsuke's, explaining that he, though small, was still a monster and needed such nourishment to replenish his strength. Himuro remembered the puppy eating the hare's heart and understood the reason for the strange sound. Misty showed him the griffin's claws, explaining their value. She explained that the claws kill germs in the water, speed up wound healing, and prolong the freshness of the meat. Himuro suggested dividing them equally. Misty was surprised, thinking he'd take it all, but he remarked that it would be more prudent. The elf smiled and agreed. Himuro looked at Matsuke's, who was frolicking happily. Then Misty said that her camp was destroyed and asked if he minded if she set up a new one next to his. She added that this way the puppy wouldn't be lonely, and they'd be able to see each other more often. Himuro knew he'd be lonely without Matsuke's, too, and Misty's help would be useful, but he was still a little hesitant. The elf said he'd be better off with her. Standing up, she asked him point-blank if he'd come from another world and offered to help him get used to it. Himuro asked if she was willing to help him. Misty put her fist to her chest and exclaimed with a smile that they would be surprised together. Himuro looked at the girl, who stood in a proud pose. He smiled and asked her what that meant. Misty reminded him that he'd been at school when he first saw her. Sujiro agreed, adding that it was his first encounter with an elf. She said she'd been surprised too, spotting him by the river, and even feigned her own astonishment. All she could think about was how a man had appeared in the forest. Himuro laughed, and Misty noticed they were both equally surprised. The elf leaned toward the boy, who was sitting with the puppy on his lap. Himuro hadn't laughed so heartily in a long time. Misty asked him again about his decision, adding that everything would be much more fun together. At that moment, Himuro felt reborn. Too many things were happening to him in quick succession, and he could barely keep up. Subconsciously, he feared that good fortune would be followed by disaster, that he would one day miss a crucial opportunity. Finally, he called Misty's name. The guy said he would rely on her. For him, it was the first step toward the future. Misty smiled and admitted she was glad to be his neighbor. Matsuke's barked, as if confirming what he'd said. Misty, petting him, asked if he'd help too. Sujiro told the puppy that they believed in him. Since Misty's shelter was destroyed and Himuro felt no attachment to his, they decided to build a real home. The elf suggested he cut down trees while she checked the surrounding area for monsters. She asked him to leave any trees with unusual crowns alone. Himuro agreed. In addition, Sujiro thanked her for the magic amulet, promising to build a good house in return. Misty asked if he was sure, as it was too small a price. Himuro clenched his fist and reminded her of her words. It was a divine relic, so the gratitude would be more than worthy. The elf agreed and said she was ready to help if needed. Sujiro waved to her in Matsuke's, then rolled up his sleeves and got to work. It was worth starting with the ground. First, he loosened it with a shovel, then compacted it and leveled the construction site. Having completed the preparations, he moved on to the trees. They needed to be cut down in the direction of the expected fall, making wedge-shaped cuts to ensure the trunk fell evenly. This made the process easier to control. The key was not to overdo it, otherwise the tree could fall anywhere. Himuro had to practice, but then his work went faster. Misty returned some time later and, seeing the number of trees he'd cut down, asked in surprise if he'd used magic. Himuro chuckled and asked if he looked like a wizard. The elf admitted she couldn't understand how he'd managed it so quickly. Smiling awkwardly, she asked if she needed help. The guy asked for help carrying the logs. Misty happily agreed, and together they carried everything to the site of the future house. First, they assembled a frame of logs, then sawed them lengthwise to create the walls. It wasn't easy, but Himuro managed it thanks to his ability to keep the logs suspended in midair. Misty laughed that the trees looked like they were floating, and he jokingly agreed that it looked like a glitch in the game. Next came the roof. They used bark and tree trimmings, strengthening the structure with Himuro's abilities. All that remained was to cover it with a suitable material. When they entered, Himuro noticed it was too dark. Misty offered to help and created a glowing orb that rose to the ceiling. Sujiro was delighted and asked if he could learn it, but she replied that he had no mana, so magic was inaccessible to him. She apologized, but added that with the divine relics, that might change. Then Himuro cut a hole in the wall and, using his powers, reinforced the stone, building a fireplace. Now there was no need to go outside to cook or warm himself by the fire. All that was left was to install a drainage system to prevent the house from being washed away by rain. As the work neared completion, a dirty Matsuke's ran up to him. Himuro picked up the puppy and said it was time for a wash. The puppy struggled, but the boy washed its paws and praised its efforts. Afterwards, Himuro sat down on a rock by the river, dangling his feet in the cool water. He was enjoying the relaxation when he heard Misty call out to him. The girl approached the shore and happily announced that she tested the soil, and it was quite fertile. Sujiro was surprised by her speed, and Misty added that now they could grow vegetables without wasting energy searching. She sat down next to him, and the boy tensed a little. Misty dipped her bare feet into the water and admitted she was sorry to be of limited use, but it was still nice to help. Sujiro looked away and said her light had already proven indispensable. Misty exclaimed that it was unfair. Unlike fire, her light emitted neither smoke nor heat, but illuminated as brightly as the lamps in Himuro's world. He realized she felt indebted. The girl remarked that creating things with her own hands was exciting and brought a strange sense of joy. She asked if that was why she felt so light-hearted because she was with him. The elf leaned over to Sujiro and called his name. Suddenly, she noticed a wooden shovel and exclaimed delightedly that she had never seen anything like it. Himuro calmly explained that it was a shovel. Misty clarified that a shovel and a scoop were different things, and he countered that any shovel could be called a shovel, but not vice versa. She was stunned by his logic, and Sujiro laughed. She nudged him, and he added with a laugh that it depended on regional differences. After some time, Himuro began working with the clay Misty had brought. Mixing it with dry grass, sand, and water, he created a strong mortar. He coated the walls of the barn with this mixture, eliminating drafts. Having finished the job, he attached a sheet of bark in place of the door and told Misty that everything was ready for the day. She was delighted. She was surprised by how much he'd accomplished that day and asked if she could live there with him. Sujiro replied that her help entitled her to it, promising to build a more comfortable bed tomorrow. Right now, it was a simple structure of a frame and stretched bark lined with grass. Misty was embarrassed and called him vulgar. She explained that men who took meticulous care in bed often frequented brothels. Himuro countered that she was the one who was vulgar. Later that evening, Misty knocked on the door and asked if he was awake. He allowed her in. The girl peeked inside and saw him sitting on the bed, playing with Matsukes. She thought he'd forgotten to turn off the light and decided to check. Himuro replied that he'd finish soon and go to bed. Misty asked what he was doing. He said it wasn't that important, but he felt obligated to finish. Meanwhile, the puppy licked his cheek. Misty picked up the wooden figurine and asked in surprise if it depicted the goddess he'd met. She remarked on its beauty, a woman with closed eyes holding a sphere. Himuro looked at his hands and admitted he hadn't seen Anna's face, but was simply remembering her voice, and his hands moved on their own. Misty smiled and said he'd improvised, but it had turned out beautifully. She added that the goddess would have loved it. The elf asked if he knew her name. Himuro paused and said she'd called herself Anna, the mother goddess of the ancient ancestors. Misty, surprised, repeated the name and admitted she'd never heard of her. She supposed the elder elves might know. Sojiro remained silent, holding the statuette. The boy recalled her words about her last strength. He thought that perhaps if Anna had chosen a more ambitious man, many would know her name. He doubted whether the goddess had made the right choice in his favor. Misty smiled and said that Anna was a powerful goddess. Himuro asked why she thought so. The girl explained that instead of glory and greatness, the goddess preferred his kindness. Spreading her arms wide, Misty said that Anna had always been like this and, even when she left, had not abandoned her path. An image of the goddess's outstretched hand appeared before Himuro's eyes. The elf called her kind and strong and admitted that this was exactly what she liked about Anna. Sujiro thought about her actions. He remembered how the goddess had asked him to live happily, and he became increasingly worried that he was violating her will by thinking about it too much. Misty sat down next to him on the bed and said the goddess must have liked him. She noted that he had interesting hobbies. Himuro asked if she really thought so, and she confirmed it. Himuro finished the statue and mounted it on a small plaque near the ceiling, like a small shelf. He folded his hands in a prayerful gesture before Anna's image. Misty praised him for his efforts, and Sujiro thanked her for keeping him company and said he was going to bed. The elf promised to dim the light and touched the glowing orb with her finger. Misty bowed low to the statue of Anna, wished Sujiro good night, and thanked him for building her home. Sujiro returned the bow and thanked her again for her presence. Looking up at the statue, he reflected that his dream of delicious food and comfort was only made possible by the goddess. Sujiro quietly thanked Anna and decided that from tomorrow on he would get down to the real work of arranging the place. In the morning, beads of sweat rolled down his face. Himuro asked if he'd heard Misty correctly. She asked, surprised, if they would be showering together. A little earlier, he'd heard a friendly female greeting. Sujiro sleepily noted that it was already morning. Suddenly, he felt a soft, warm touch. There were strange sounds in the room, and this made him open his eyes. Misty stood by the shore and repeated her good morning wishes. The boy's face remained damp. He returned the greeting and said he'd woken up thanks to Matsuke's. Taking a few sips of water, Himuro was surprised by its purity. The griffin's claw had actually worked. He remarked that the water was good enough for washing, and took another sip. Misty enthusiastically announced that she wanted to join in and came closer, asking if they would wash together. Himuro asked in amazement, and Misty repeated the question, checking if he'd heard right. He looked shocked and asked if she was joking. She asked if he was the type to wash once a week, and said she liked to wash daily herself. Sujiro remarked that more than once a week was difficult for him, and that this schedule was more convenient. Misty exclaimed that that was excellent and invited him to come along. She explained that it was safer with two people, one to wash, the other to stand guard, as monsters might attack. Himuro understood it was a precaution, and Misty apologized for not explaining it sooner. The girl smiled and added that she trusted him, which was why she'd invited him. Sujiro, holding Matsuke's in his arms, thought he had nothing to worry about. Misty washed herself while floating in midair. Himuro watched her from behind and remarked on the convenience of her enhanced vision. Having finished her ablutions, the elf dried herself with a towel and said it was his turn. Himuro agreed. Sujiro noticed the towel was hers. Misty, already changed, explained she didn't have another one and decided to borrow this one. He couldn't help but remember how she'd just dried her body with it. Afterwards, Misty dried her hair using a spell that created a strong airflow. Himuro said it was very convenient. The elf remarked that he was always amazed by magic, adding that it could quickly dry both hair and clothes. The girl offered to wash his clothes while he was in the river. Sujiro declined, saying he'd get them himself after his swim. He undressed, covering himself with a towel, and decided to dry himself with his shirt, which he'd leave to dry later. The water in the river was cold but pleasant. There were fish swimming in it, too. They both washed up successfully, and for breakfast they ate char fried in a stone pan. During the meal, Misty asked about their plans. Himuro replied that he wanted to make the place more comfortable and get some furniture. He offered to leave the hunting to her if she didn't mind. The girl happily agreed, adding that she wanted to teach Matsuke's hunting skills. In response to her question about his plans, Sujiro said he'd start with the table and chairs. At that moment, the puppy was scratching the log they were sitting on with his paw. Himuro noted that sitting on a log was too low, and the puppy was constantly reaching for their food. So a real table was needed. He began to consider which option to choose. Ultimately, he decided to make two thin plates with a slot in the center to serve as legs. This would make the table stable and easy to carry. Himuro inserted one board into another and topped them with a third, completing the structure. He carefully examined the resulting table and admitted that it turned out quite well. The table could be easily disassembled and stored conveniently. Sujiro figured the next steps were chairs, a door, windows, a cooking area, and at least one shelf. He desperately needed paper and a pen to write down everything he needed. Focusing, Himuro began assembling the chairs, trying to do everything evenly and neatly. He carefully worked the wood, and soon the kitchen table and 2 chairs were in place. At that moment, Misty called him over, inviting him to look at the find. The girl, smiling broadly, held a huge insect in her hands and joyfully announced that she had caught a silk moth. Himuro cried out in horror, wondering what kind of monster it was. Misty chided him for his rudeness, saying it was an animal spirit. The boy asked again what that meant. She explained that animal spirits were different from ordinary creatures, they seemed to come from fairy tale worlds and were extremely rare. Himuro was surprised and asked what he was needed for. Misty explained that the furry insect had flown in on its own and declared it wanted to live with Sujiro. When he asked in surprise if she'd spoken to him, she explained that she was more likely to understand their intentions than to engage in a dialogue. Meanwhile, the moth had settled right on the kitchen table. Suddenly, a magic circle flared up above him, causing both of them to become wary. A moment later, a silk cloth appeared in the butterfly's paws, which he handed to Sujiro. He took it in amazement. Himuro asked Misty if the insect really wanted to stay. She confirmed it and asked his opinion. Sujiro said he was fine with it, adding that he hadn't even hoped to get the fabric. He allowed the moth to live with them. The butterfly made a soft sound, and the boy smiled and said he understood it as a greeting. Misty agreed with this interpretation. Sujiro ran his hand over the spirit's soft fur, and at that moment, Matsuke's barked. The puppy bared its teeth at the insect, and its owner had to calm it down. Himuro sat down next to it, petted Matsuke's, and asked him to befriend the moth. Misty, however, paused and asked Sujiro to give the spirit a name. He suggested the name Musubi and explained that it was the name of the god of sericulture, and that the moth itself resembled a silkworm. Hearing this, the moth settled right on the boy's head, as if showing approval. Sujiro remarked that he liked the name and told Misty that with the arrival of the fabric, they could do much more. But along with the joyful event, he did not notice the serious mistake he had made. At the table where he and Misty now sat, with Musubi comfortably perched above, Himuro thought they finally had room to eat. But then, suddenly, an idea struck him. He jumped up, slammed his palms on the table, and a look of horror crossed his face. Misty, confused, asked what had happened and joked that it felt like he'd been stung. Sujiro exclaimed that he'd forgotten something extremely important. He immediately began hurriedly tinkering with something at his workbench. When Misty asked for help, he snapped that he could handle it himself. The elf turned to Musubi, assuming he was now observing something new. Himuro himself scolded himself for his forgetfulness. Soon he stood up straight, hands on his hips. The prepared wooden parts were already lying on the ground, all that remained was to assemble the base. He dug a hole, laid a stone foundation around it, and began to assemble a small structure from planks. Working for speed rather than strength, Sujiro built a simple but practical booth. Himuro made a hole in the floor above the pit under the booth, placed a smooth log with a notch on top and covered it with another board with a hole, adding a lid that could be raised and lowered. He then placed the leaves on a small wooden shelf, poured water into the sink, and dropped the griffin's claw in. The finishing touch was a silk cloth hung nearby. Sujiro exclaimed joyfully that everything was now ready: a polished toilet with a lid, leaves for wiping, a musubi cloth, and a sink for washing hands with a claw inside appeared in the booth. He wondered what to do with the material that would accumulate below, but decided to put it off. Right now, it was more important to test the structure, and the boy felt completely at peace. The toilet was finished, and Misty needed to be informed. She walked inside, closed the door, and glanced at the toilet. The elf noted with surprise that Sujiro had created something too beautiful for its intended purpose, but most importantly, the problem with comfort had been solved. Himuro also created a separate space for Matsuke's. The next day, as Himuro stood at the table, he noticed a new guest. Musubi brought a large creature and perched on the boy's head. The guest waved a clawed paw in greeting. The animal landed on the ground, and Himuro realized with surprise that it was an armadillo. The creature began waving its paws vigorously, and Sujiro, confused, called out to Misty. The girl joyfully exclaimed that he was being pursued by animal spirits. She explained that these were riddles spirits that were excellent at cultivating the soil. Himuro remarked on how convenient this was and wondered if magic was involved. Sujiro named the armadillo Yukatama, explaining that it was the name of a fertility god, and asked if she liked it. Yukatama stretched his paws out and made a drawn-out sound, which the girl took as approval. Misty added with a smile that Yukatama had offered to take care of the plants and even work with the soil in the toilet. Himuro asked if he wanted to start composting and thanked him for his help. He also asked the girl what to feed the spirit. Sujiro noted that bark wouldn't be a problem, and there were berries in the forest, too. Misty assured him that riddles were capable of growing their own food. The boy called the armadillo self-sufficient and realized that all it needed was soil. Inspired, he picked up a shovel and decided to get to work, starting with uprooting the stumps. To do this, it was necessary to first dig up the soil around the stump and then remove the stump itself. Without heavy equipment, this would have taken quite a while. Sujiro began digging and trimming the roots, but soon grew tired and decided to put the process off, realizing it was taking too long. Remembering his equipment, he picked up the hook with chains, created with the power of the craft tool. He secured one hook to an air block resting on the ground, and attached the second to a stump. Pulling on the chains, Himuro pulled out the stump with ease, which surprised him. He didn't even have to exert any effort, and it seemed incredibly simple. He assumed it was the power of the crafting equipment, but he was glad the work was now progressing. After that, work proceeded smoothly. Himuro uprooted stumps, and Yukatama carried them away from the field. Soon, the clearing was complete. Sujiro wanted to check if there was enough space for a vegetable garden, but the armadillo had already set to work. Himuro sank into a chair, enjoying the long-awaited rest. However, he soon became curious about what Yukatama was doing and went to take a look. The boy started asking questions, but froze mid-sentence. Sujiro was amazed. The field was already dug up in neat rows. He looked around and spotted Yukatama sitting on a stump, gnawing on a piece of wood. The boy thanked the spirit for his work and promised to help if he needed anything. Later, Himuro was discussing with Misty how things were going well for them now. Masubi was making fabric, Yukatama was tending the soil and fertilizing, meaning they wouldn't have to throw anything away. Their gazes fell on Matsuke's, strolling near the riddles, and Sujiro continued his thoughts. He wondered why they were gathering such an unusual zoo: a puppy, a moth, and an armadillo. Himuro was even more surprised to see the animals growing in number. Misty guessed it was the divine aura emanating from the statue of Anna the boy had erected. Sujiro asked if this would bring problems. The elf explained that, on the contrary, it was a blessing, confidently adding that this was his destiny. Misty reminded him that he had encountered a rare creature at their first meeting, and winked slyly, hinting at herself. Himuro replied that if all this was fate, then he was glad, and admitted that he was happy to meet Misty. The girl blushed, asked if he was serious, and, looking away, awkwardly scratched the back of her head. Sujiro smiled and thought that life had become much more enjoyable with her cooking. Meanwhile, Misty managed to defeat the boar monster, without even knowing how. The day was turning out to be an exceptionally successful one. Meanwhile, the Adventurers Guild was in turmoil. A figure in dark clothing entered the room and approached the counter. A worker demanded to see the guild card and remove the hood. The man placed the card, and a girl with rings on her fingers instinctively took it. Seeing the name, her eyes widened in horror, realizing who was standing in front of her. Soon, a cry of Black Sea Ion echoed through the hall, and the silence gave way to whispers. People discussed the frail young man, the royal court's personal mage, and wondered why he had come to the guild. The girl behind the counter took out a cigarette, raised an eyebrow and asked why such a high-ranking person was here. Meanwhile, Himuro was examining a lump of salt in his hands and noticed that its supply was rapidly dwindling. Misty was surprised and explained that she was mining salt downstream. She mentioned that she was planning to take up another project. The girl explained that there was a city in the same direction and suggested that we take a look there. Sujiro was slightly taken aback, but Misty clarified, in the city, you could buy not only salt but also ink, dyes, and seasonings. This inspired the boy, and he was already eager to go there, thinking about new dishes. He noticed that they had nothing to sell, but Misty winked and assured him that there would be no problem, since they had Himuro himself. Misty and Sujiro prepared to leave, and Musubi went with them. Matsuke's had to be left behind, as he was considered a monster, and Yukatama remained to look after him and the dwelling. The girl calculated that the journey would take 3 days, or the morning of the 4th. Himuro noted to himself that the distance was quite long. Misty admitted with a smile that she would have gotten there faster alone, as elves move faster than humans. Suddenly, she became alert, hearing something to her right, and informed her companion. The road to the city was not without danger. Aggressive monsters appeared along the way, including horned rabbits. When one of the horned rabbits crashed into a boulder, Sujiro and Misty noticed that Musubi had assisted with his magic. They whispered about the furry companion's strength and thanked their good fortune that Misty could sense the approach of enemies in advance. Attacks were more frequent than Himuro had expected, and they moved more cautiously. At some point, the elf cautiously called out to Sujiro and warned him that something huge was moving towards them. A giant snake with 2 heads, its forked tongue sticking out terribly, crawled out from between the trees. Himuro peered out from behind a tree, assessed the monster's size, and, catching his breath, ran out, deliberately drawing attention to himself. Both snakes turned their heads in his direction. At that moment, Misty, armed with her blades, rushed to attack. One of the snake heads turned toward her and opened its mouth, but the elf slashed it away with a sharp blow. Then Misty jumped back to the higher ground. The second head lunged at her, but was struck by a log launched by Himuro. The girl shielded herself from the flying wood chips and dirt with her hand. Sujiro reasoned that if they took their time, they could handle it. He stepped closer to the snake's body and confidently parried the attack with his sturdy cane. Himuro rammed his stick into the monster, pinning it to the ground and securing its hold. He then looked back and confidently declared that the danger had passed. The boy remembered Misty's advice: even a headless snake can still move. He thanked her and asked if she was hurt. She replied that everything was fine and, with a slight smile, offered to walk together. They soon noticed the snake's head growing back. Destroying it again, they achieved final victory. Misty grabbed Sujiro's hands and enthusiastically praised him, unable to believe they had managed to defeat such a monster. Himuro realized that the victory had indeed been hard-won. Without the fixation, the 2-headed snake could regenerate indefinitely. Misty happily declared that the magic stone could be sold profitably. Sujiro realized that this was precisely what she meant when she told him not to worry. They placed the finds in the prepared bags, and Musubi even helped carry one. After some time, Himuro made a hammock in the forest, stretching it between 2 trees to make a place to sleep. This hammock didn't take up any space and eliminated the need to sleep on the damp ground. Sujiro coated the ropes with insect repellent and lay down, thinking that life had become much easier with Musubi's arrival. Misty offered to grill some meat, but he asked them to wait. For dinner, they cooked snake soup with herbs. Despite the strange smell, the taste was decent. Misty remarked that Himuro was becoming a real adventurer, and he replied with a smile that it was thanks to the goddess. After that, the guy admitted that the adventurer's life wasn't really his thing. Misty listened silently, slowly chewing her meat. At night, Musubi patrolled under the treetops, guarding Himuro and Misty's sleep. At dawn on the 3rd day, Misty announced with a satisfied smile that they had already reached the road, and that the city was now only an hour away. Sujiro walked alongside them, carrying Musubi and his backpack. He noticed that the very atmosphere around them had changed. Misty confirmed that he had felt it, and explained that beyond that, they were entering a normal forest. Misty emphasized that the magical power here is weaker, so monsters are encountered significantly less often. Moreover, people regularly destroy them to protect these lands. To protect and cleanse the area, troops of soldiers were assembled, constantly fighting the monsters. The monsters damaged the fields, destroyed crops, and preyed on livestock. Himuro covered his face with his hand and thought it all sounded like a classic fantasy. The girl added that even weak creatures could cause trouble. Sujiro noted that after destroying them, magical stones could be mined and asked if this was useful for people. Misty replied that there wouldn't be any significant income from this. The cost of maintaining an army wasn't justified by such loot, so the venture wasn't considered profitable. Sujiro had expected something different and was a little disappointed. Soon they emerged from the forest completely. Sujiro noticed that the path had become a proper road. Misty pointed forward and called to him, indicating the human city spreading out ahead, called Braunwald.